Mrs. Sugars, will you take roll call, please?
Mrs. Arroyo,
Here.
Ms. Friedel,
Here.
Mr. Goodwin,
Here.
Mrs. Matlack,
Here.
Mrs. Neary,
Here.
Mr. Avadia,
Here.
Mrs. Schultz,
Here.
Mrs. Tong,
Here.
Mrs. Seidel.
Here. Okay, next I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Malash because we have some board recognition this evening.
Thank you, Mrs. Seidel. Let me just find my paper again. I am very excited that we are recognizing, and the board is recognizing, 2 students who are currently students at Rosa Middle School, each of whom will be recipients of the 2020 Prudential Spirit Award. So I want to talk a little bit about the 2 young men who are both with us, and I think some family members in the audience. And then I'm going to ask them to come up to the podium after I do this piece to meet Mrs. Wilson and I, and we have certificates. And normally, for those of you that are regular attendees of the board meeting, we have honorees come around and shake hands with the board and with everybody. We're going to dispense from the handshaking. So we'll, do a little wave, we'll do some silent cheers, and that kind of stuff. And then Mrs. Wilson will go out in the hallway and get pictures of you guys afterwards, okay? So both Kyle Lehrfeld and Asher Boyskin both donated close to 1,000 hours in community service. Both of them, close to 1,000 hours in community service, which absolutely is incredible. If you sit down sometime tonight when you go home, sit down and figure out how many hours 1,000 really is when you're going to school, when you have a life, when you have a family, everything else that's going on to go through. So Kyle's projects included working weekly as a teacher's aide at a local religious school with pre-K to 5 children, including assuming the important role of teaching character education and perspective taking. The most important moment for Kyle was learning to understand each student's unique approach to learning and supporting them in their learning. So Kyle, if you would stand and come up to the podium. And then Kyle, you're just going to stand for a moment. And then Asher. Asher's projects included working with the organization Little Mentors and the program Book Smiles. Through his work, he was able to identify schools in need and provide them with donated books. As a founding member of Little Mentors, a most important moment was understanding the impact of reading and the service learning that can be associated with it. Asher.
Thank you.
And would either of you like to say a few words just about your project?
Thank you.
Mr. Guy, anything?
They have no words.
Then you have no words in this call? So then, like I say, normally we shake hands with the board, but just a little wave. Everybody's incredibly proud of you. And then Mrs. Wilkins and I will come out front and get pictures for you, okay? You're welcome to come back and see the rest of the meeting. But you don't have to.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Congratulations. Thank you.
Okay, now we'll move into, we have several presentations tonight, and I'll let Dr. Malash introduce our first presenter.
Is this Dr. Britt?
Dr. Grip, yep.
Excellent. So I'm very excited that the night has finally come. We've been waiting for this night for a while. I'm going to ask Dr. Grip to approach the microphone. Dr. Grip is a very famous researcher who does demographic studies throughout the Northeast. I'll let him he can tell you a little bit more about himself, but a former college professor and an expert in doing demographic studies. He's been hired by the majority of school districts in the state of New Jersey who have been involved in endeavors such as ours to take a hard look at ourselves, who we are, and what next steps are for the district. So he submitted his written report. We shared that out with the board over the course of, in the last memo, over the course of the weekend. We've had some time to go through it. He's going to do a presentation as a slideshow for you all tonight. He will be happy to take questions, and then I'm expecting that the board will have some questions and some discussion as we go through as well. So, Dr. Grip.
Thank you, Dr. Malash. Okay, first slide, please. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for allowing me to come speak. I always like to speak to boards of ed because I try to summarize somewhat of a dense report. And some people, maybe in 20 minutes, you can glean a lot from the information as opposed to the 60 or so pages that it is. So the first thing is my company's called Statistical Forecasting. We've been around for about 22 years doing work just like this. It's the only type of work we do. It's called school demography. That's what we are. There's only about 100 of us in the country. So if there's any students out here that want to get into a career like this, I'm actually hiring someone. It's on Indeed.com looking for people. It's hard to get people. If you're into math and you like doing mapping and GIS and things like that, it's a good career. So our firm has done over 150 school districts in the state, but we've expanded into Virginia. We're doing a lot of county-based schools down in that direction. And since 2006, we do all the enrollment projections for the New York City Public Schools, the largest school district in the nation. So we see a lot of different issues compared to some small suburban districts. Next, please. I'm the executive director. I have a doctorate from Rutgers in EdStat and measurement. Most of us wind up going to work for ETS or the College Board, looking at reliability and validity testing issues, but that's not what I wanted to do. I'm actually a former school teacher by trade. I was a physics and statistics teacher at Bridgewater Raritan, which is up in Somerset County, for about 8 years. And the superintendent, as I'm going through my dissertation, trying to figure out what the heck to write about, he says, you know, you should take your statistics and do something in this field and write a thesis about that. And that's what I did. I did a multiple regression model and projecting enrollment. So it turned out okay. I do a lot of, I still write for journals. It's very important in my career to keep that up. And I testify as an expert witness in ALJ hearings for districts who want to get divorces from each other, but that's neither here nor there. So next slide, please. So when most people think of a demographic study, the first thing they think of is it's just an enrollment projection study, but that's really not the case. There's a lot more to it than just that. We will project out up to, in some cases for big cities, 10 or so years, but for smaller districts, we only go out 5 years, and that's what was done here. And that's the first question I usually get from board members. Why can't you go out further than 5? Well, the big problem is we have to start projecting kids who aren't born yet. And that's really hard statistically to get a good confidence interval on that number. I do it for the city of New York, but it requires having the fertility rates of women that are 20 to 24 and 35 to 39, so on and so forth, much more complicated. So I also looked at the community population trends, age structure, birth fertility rates to get a flavor of what's going on here. I looked at your enrollments by the last 10 years by district-wide in those elementary, middle, and high school grade configurations, and also by race and poverty status in each school. What was the racial and poverty status distribution in each one of your schools? Is there an imbalance or a balance? That's kind of things I was looking at. And finally, and this is the big one, this is probably why you brought me down here, is what is the impact of new housing developments on enrollment? There's approximately 2,000 new housing units coming up in Cherry Hill. Next, please. So this slide is showing the historical populations over time from 1940 to 2010 on the left side of that vertical line. And you can see most of the growth here happened in the 50s and 60s. After that, it's been pretty much static. The right side is from another agency called the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. They're projecting your population up till 2040. I'm sure this is going to get revised once the 2020 census comes out, but as you can see, staying in the 71,000 range, and as far as 2018, the most recent data we have, the population in Cherry Hill was 71,009, which is almost the same as it was in 2010. So really not much going on in terms of growth at the moment. Next, please. So continuing on looking at your community as a whole, I look at different data from the census from 2000 and 2010, because we don't have 2020 yet. That won't be till 2021. And I also use data from something called the ACS, American Community Survey. That's a a census instrument that is used in the intercensal years. I don't like to use it that much because it's only a 1% sample for every year that they use. So it's very, very small, and sometimes the confidence intervals are very, very wide. But you're becoming more racially diverse. As you can see up there, 78% white in the most recent census and 85% in 2000. Asians are the second largest race. You're a little bit older than the state median by about 4 years. A little less foreign-born than the state. India and China are the largest sources of the foreign-born population. Very, very educated community. Bachelor's degree or higher, 55%, states 38%. Your income levels are higher than the state as well by about 25,000, as you can see. Very big in terms of housing, 28,000 units. That's enormous. They're almost more than 3/4 are one-unit homes, which means detached single family, or attached, which would be townhouses, things of that nature. The renter-occupied population isn't that big, 20%, which is less than the state, which is about 34%. But the median value of owner-occupied unit is $269,000, which I think is a fair price. I don't know if most of you know, I actually drove from Vermont to get here. I don't live in New Jersey anymore, so the pricing down here I think seems pretty good. All right, next slide, please. So this is showing all the locations of all the schools in the township. What's interesting, of course, you know this, and I got to learn it, is that you're bisected by the Turnpike and I-295 right there in the middle, which basically cuts you into the west and the east. Next, please. So this is showing the elementary attendance areas. So what we did in coordination with your administration, we were able to identify the neighborhood elementary attendance areas and then come up with what's called a shapefile. A shapefile is a mapping file that we use in GIS. And the thing that's interesting up there, if you take a look, so every color is a different zone. But some colors, if you look in the western side, that light green, I think that's Kilmer up there if I can read that far away, but they're not contiguous, okay? And you'll see other places like Johnson, which straddles both the left and the right-hand side of the highways. So the elementary attendance areas over time have probably evolved depending upon how many kids are coming into certain areas. All right, next, please. Now, the middle school attendance areas are a lot easier. Of course, Rosa is an option school, so it doesn't have an attendance area, but Carusi and Beck, left and right. Next, please. The high school attendance areas, that's west and east. Next. So let's talk about your enrollment. As of October 15th, now October 15th is your school census day. It's the day that you report your enrollment to the DOE. So that's the reason why I have your 1015 date up there as 10,845. And all the data I will be talking about from annually that you've had historically will be from that specific date. So enrollment had declined for 6 years before reversing trend in this most current year when it went up. But if we look at the longer term, last 10 years, your enrollment's been declining. Loss of 557 students since the 10-11 year when it was over 11,000. And we use something called the Cohort Survival Ratio method, which I'll talk about in a moment, to project enrollments 5 years out. It's the state-approved method. Next, please. So there's your enrollment. Just take a look at the very last bar on the far right, and you can see that you've gained roughly about 100 students from the year prior. Next. All right, this is my favorite slide of the night. I always tell people if you want to sleep through all my presentations and you want to stay awake for one, this might be the one. And the reason I say that is because if you look at what's happening with the elementary population, it's usually a good clue of what's going to happen in your projections because they will advance to the middle and high school over the projection period. Well, the elementary one is the one up top. And you can see that it had been declining, but it seemed to have turned around quite a bit this current year. So it's reverse trend. The middle and the high, which are the lower two lines, the high school is actually on the middle part, have really been relatively stable. Okay, next, please. So to project enrollments, like I said, we use this progression method called the Cohort Survival Ratio method. And what we do is we look at how students progress historically from one grade to the next. So a simple example up there, if you have 100 first graders in the 18-19 year becoming 95 second graders in this current year, the survival rate, now no one dies, is 95 over 100, or 0.95. So if you're losing students, the values are less than 1. If it's greater than 1, you're gaining students. So I did that for all the grade progressions, including birth to kindergarten, which is a 5-year gap. So there's 13 possible ratios all the way up to 11 through 12. And I went back 10 years. 10 of those 13 ratios are above 1, which means that you have inward migration coming into the school district. So once we compute an average of the ratios for each grade progression, we apply that and multiply it times the most recent enrollment in this year and extrapolate that forward to get your projections. Next. Okay, this is an interesting phenomenon. You have something called first grade replacement, negative first grade replacement here. It's happened for the last 9 years, ranging from 81 to 261 students. What it is, it's when the number of graduating 12th graders is greater than the number of first grade students replacing them. And you might say, well, why am I not comparing it to kindergarten? Well, you have a half-day K program here. So you get this bump up where people may send their kids to private school for kindergarten. So rather than comparing it to kindergarten, I look at it compared to the first grade. It's more of a leveling factor. So in essence, you don't have enough first graders to balance out what you're losing in the senior class. And you've lost an average of 184 kids per year in the last 5 years. Next. That actually shows how many kids you're losing to this phenomenon over a 10-year period. Next, please. That's the same chart that you just saw superimposed with enrollment change, how much the district's enrollment has changed year over year. Now, if you take a look at the far right, the blue is the enrollment change. You see that what's happening here, due to your inward migration, the negative kindergarten, the negative first grade replacement isn't as negative. It gets reduced by the inward migration of students, either causing a total enrollment gain in the district, like you see in the far right, or on the few bars to the left, you'll see that the negative first grade replacement has been partially offset by this inward migration. So sometimes the inward migration is enough to counter this particular phenomenon. Next. So Berts are used to project kindergarten students 5 years later. I did mention that. We looked at birth data from 05 to the 18 year. We do not have 19 data yet. But what's happening here is you have Berts slowly increasing. That's always an indicator. Once Berts start to increase, if a lot of people come to public school, that's always an indicator that you're going to have more in kindergarten and growth in the elementary and then increasing enrollment. So what I did, I was able to contact the Department of Health, and rather than just getting Berts for the township, I got Berts by census block, which are these tiny increments in census geographic data, where then I can do what's called a map overlay to determine where the Berts are in each one of those elementary attendance areas, which is really interesting when we go to the next couple slides. First, this is the number of Berts in Cherry Hill over time on the second column, how many students come 5 years later, and then your Bert to kindergarten survival ratio. We're not going home yet, are we? Making sure that wasn't mine. So what you see on the ratios, they're all less than 1 for the most part, and that's common for a half-day K program because a lot of people would send their kids to first grade kindergarten private schools like I had mentioned. But in the last year, it was above 1 by quite a bit. So that's telling me you got people moving in here probably with kids in tow under the age of 5. They want to have their kids educated here. Next, please. This shows you the Berts by attendance area that I mentioned. I did it by year from 2005 to 18. Now, if you look at the very bottom, it shows you the total for each attendance area and the difference between the Berts in the 05 year versus the 18 year. So first one that you see for the total in blue, the Barton area, has over 1,300 Berts in that cumulative period, while the Cooper area had 330. I mean, talk about an incredibly big difference. So, the Kilmer area is second largest at 1,281. So, when I looked at that, it can tell you where your pockets are of kids. But if you look at the next row down, you can see that over that time period, who has had the greatest number of Berts from the 18 year compared to the 05 year, and that's the Kilmer area, plus 57, as well as the Barton area at plus 47. The other ones really haven't changed by much. If you look at the far right, you may see a column that says unknown. That comes from the Department of Health. They just were not able to figure out where in Cherry Hill the mother, her address was. So they know she lives here, but they really can't tell me more than that. So I had to redistribute them into the attendance areas on a proportional basis. Next, please. So now this is going to be, think of this as a heat map. So red and orange would be your hottest. So in terms of number of Berts in the 05 year, you have Barton on the northwest corner there with the most. If we advance to the next slide, 18 year. I'm using the exact same scale as the previous slides for comparison purpose. You can see that Berts are starting to increase. You got Johnson over there straddling the highways with a number, as well as Kilmer. But the blue and the purples, if you toggle back and forth between 05 and 18, it's on the eastern side of the township. Okay, we can go on to the next. So if you look at the change in the Berts from the 05 year to the 18 year, it's the same principle. Which the ones that have gained the most are the reds and the oranges. The losers are down in the blues. So the western sides have gained the most. Next, please. This is showing the total number of Berts over that time. Again, it's the western side of the highway. When you start to see this whole thing, it visually, it starts to really sink in your brain what's going on here. Next, please. I also showed you the Berts by census block. Doing a map of the number of kids that are born in blocks. Dark blue would be the greatest number, and beige's color would be next to nothing. So if we advance to the next slide, you can see that the dark blue regions, again, on the western side of the highway, 13 years later. Okay, this is just showing the historical birth counts for the township over time. If you take a look in the 11 year, you had 597 Berts. That's when it declined. And then since then, it's been trekking upwards. You've basically gained about 150 or so Berts from the 18 year to the 11 year. That is a lot. Next, please. So I was asked to do the enrollments, look at the historical enrollments by race. Now, in the report, it's very, very detailed. It goes by school as well. But this is showing you it by the district-wide. Looking at it from the 14-15 year to the 19-20 year, you can see that the white population has been declining. That's the blue one. The Hispanic population, which is in orange, has been increasing. Okay, and the, let's see, I think that's, the others haven't been really too far different over time. Those are the two main ones there. So this is the economically disadvantaged chart. It shows you the school, the percentage of kids that are economically disadvantaged or have free and reduced lunch, basically, in each one of the schools over time, and then the change in percentage points from the 19-20 year to the 14-15 year. So a couple things to note. First of all, a lot of the schools have actually had a decline in the percentage of economically disadvantaged over time. That's one thing. You see a lot of negatives on the right-hand side. But in terms of who has the most economically disadvantaged, it's Barton at around 31%, and Knight is down the other end of the spectrum. I think that's 4 point something. I can't quite see because that blue is pretty light. 4.9? Thank you. So that's a pretty big difference. You look down at the elementary level, Carusi has the most of the middle schools, and ignoring the alternative high school, Cherry Hill West has the highest percentage currently of the high schools. Next, please. So again, I like to show things by map sometimes. This is showing the economically disadvantaged just for the elementary schools by zone, where dark blue is showing the most and the color of yellow would be the least. So if we advance that to the 1920, you could see that a lot of that dark blue went away because, as I mentioned before, the percentage of economically disadvantaged has declined. Next, please. All right, this is hard to read. This is the listing of all the new housing that is planned here in Cherry Hill. And this I can't take credit for. I received this information from the Cherry Hill Planning and Zoning Department. They were great, by the way. I'll just give a little shout out to them because sometimes it's very hard to get information from the municipalities that I work with. And not only did they give me the number of units, which is always, of course, the most important thing, but the second thing I need there, which is the second to last column, is the bedroom distribution. The reason that that is important is, and I'll tell you that you can see the bottom number there, it says 2,000 units. Well, the number there to me isn't really that important. It's the type of unit that is being built. A one-bedroom unit for an apartment doesn't really yield many children at all. It's those three-bedroom units that are going to yield for an apartment, and more so if you had detached single-family homes. So if you had 2,000 detached single-family homes here, that would be like a whoa type moment. But please don't look at the number as much as the type of unit and how the bedroom distribution is. Okay, next please. So this is a map that shows you, again, where the housing is located. So most of it, as you can see, the bigger ones, the 3 in red, are in the Barton attendance area. There's a couple down in the southern part, in the eastern side, as you can see as well. Next, please. So after we use some what's called state multipliers, a multiplier is the number of children per housing unit by bedroom and type, meaning market rate and affordable apartments, detached single-family homes, and townhouses. I got these values from the state of New Jersey. They're averages for the state. This is the yield from all the developments that were listed in that other table about 2 slides ago. So when you tally it all up, it's 440 kids. It may not seem like a lot to you if you have 2,000 units, but it's, again, those bedroom distributions have a lot to deal with it. So if we go to the next slide, I jumped ahead of myself. I'll talk about what I thought. No, go ahead. Stay on home sales. So this is Cherry Hill home sales over time. And you can see how it declined in the 2011 year due to the housing market crash and banking crisis where people could not get those faulty mortgages. Now it's starting to go back up. My theory is that the home sales in the last 3 or 4 years have really gone up, and they're at the level they were in 2005 when the market was hot. Who's going to be buying homes in your community? I think they're families with kids, probably under the age of 5. They want to come into your school system. So it's probably not going to be, for the most part, empty nesters like myself. Next, please. So enrollment projections were done by individual school, and I did 2 kinds. One, which I refer to as baseline, assuming that all the housing, for whatever reason, didn't come to fruition. And then another set of projections which assume that housing is going to occur, called the adjusted projections. So the baseline projections is showing almost a flat enrollment. That's kind of mysterious. That's kind of not accurate to look at that number there, 10,833, without telling you what the elementary and middle and high would be. I would just tell you that the elementary, in the baseline alone, is projecting a gain of 620 students. So even without all the housing, you can expect enrollment gain. Why? Inward migration, stronger birth counts going up, bigger birth counts. Tack on all the housing, now you're talking about a gain of 381 total, but again, where's the impact at the elementary level? Why is the middle and high school still going to decline? It's because you got to get these elementary cohorts currently that are smaller through the system. So at some point in time, guess what? You're going to have big enrollment increases at the middle and high school, but that's beyond the 5-year projection period. But you can see what I'm getting at. Next, please. So what I was able to do is go into your long-range facility plan and compare the enrollment in each of those schools currently to the capacity of the building. Now, the capacity is really not a fixed fire code type number. It's how you're using the building currently. So if you happen to have more special ed classrooms, that's going to reduce the capacity because you can't have as many kids in a special ed classroom. So it's not a fixed number. I consider it more fluid. So what the fourth column in where it says difference, that compares the current enrollment to the capacity. If it's blue, you have a surplus of seating. If you have a red value, you have a shortage of seating. So the only school right now that you really have at the elementary level that's a shortage is Barclay. But when you get to the 24-25 year, due to this increasing enrollment I just talked about, you have about 6 schools that are projected to have a shortage of seating. Of course, you can do things differently to balance that out. You can increase class sizes, things like that. You can change attendance areas, but right now, as you have 6 schools that might have a shortage. At the middle and the middle school level, it looks like you're going to be okay. And at the high school level, because of declining enrollment, East and West will have surplus seats as well. Next, please. So to cap this up and summarize, enrollments are projected to increase in the next 5 years, provided that the proposed new housing is constructed. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, those factors leading to that projected enrollment gain are the inward migration of students. I think it's, again, likely due to the home resales, the increase in the township's birth rate, and those 2,000 new housing units. The enrollment declines are projected at the middle and high schools because those existing smaller cohorts at the elementary level have to move through the system. So with that, next slide, I will open it up to you for questions.
I do have one question. So it looked like there was a bump in the enrollment. You said that the last year you took the enrollment count. What year was the last year? Was it the 2018-2019 school year or 2019-2020?
The 1920 year is the last year.
Okay.
This current
And
year.
did that account, that you take into account full day kindergarten at that point in time?
No,
Oh.
because that was. So let me explain where my data sources are coming from. So the first data point that all the data historically is coming from the Department of Ed, but the 1920 data yet is not available to us yet from the state. So the 1920 data I get from what's called your SSID file from NJ Smart. It's this big, massive thing where we have to run a lot of pivot tables. So I actually got it from your district, but it doesn't have all the classifications that I probably would need. So you have full day this year is what you're telling me? Okay, so that makes sense now of why you have that bump. Because you got more people. All right, that's great. Wish I would have known that.
So I have a question, but you're probably not going to know the answer. So those numbers are just based on births and migration in to the neighborhoods. But something I don't see overlaid there, and maybe it is open enrollment. And so we're showing it by school, but at the middle school and high school, that's going to skew those numbers dramatically.
So here's the thing. Policy decisions are something that I cannot work with. So I'm really going with a couple things. Kids' residential zones that they're supposed to go to and the patterns that they normally would go to in terms of, so Rosa, for instance, if I remember correctly, has every third year, correct me if I'm wrong, you have this bump up in the enrollment count for the entering sixth grade population. So I just cycle through all those different types of things, assuming they're going to go in the future. But you're correct. When you get involved with those options, it's there. I'm just assuming that whatever's happened historically is going to continue. Yes, sir.
So just as a clarification, on one of the last slides, it shows that we need more capacity in most of the elementary schools, if I'm correct. But is that assuming the 2004 units happen, or is that
That's a good
not
question.
assuming?
Yeah, so I did the worst case scenario there. So that's for the adjusted enrollment projections. But the difference between the adjusted and the baseline at the elementary level is approximately about 150 kids for the whole elementary level. So even if you ran the baseline numbers and the capacity, I still think you're going to see a shortage of seating throughout.
Is there a way, because you use birth rate numbers, but there are families where grandparents may be raising children who initially weren't Cherry Hill residents or adoption? Is there any way to factor anything in, or that's just extra?
Well, there's a lot of qualitative data that are captured by a lot of these ratios, these grade progression ratios that we're talking about, but we can't extract and say what's causing these things to happen. So for instance, say you had an economic downturn in this area and we see people moving out because they don't have jobs in nearby Philadelphia. We could see the ratios perhaps going down, but we can't say exactly what's the reason that it's happening. So that's one of those qualitative things that are nested within the numbers.
I just wanted to say thank you. I know many of us have been waiting for this information for quite some time, and so my question is really more for Dr. Malash and administration, since as we've been discussing in strategic planning and at the board table for quite a long time, this information was going to sort of drive those next steps and those next discussions that we've been having at strategic planning to come up with our long-term strategic plan. So I just wanted to hear what your thoughts are about how this information moves into that next phase and what, if any, initial thoughts administration has based on this information.
Sure. Thanks, Ms. Sugars. And again, thank you to Dr. Grip for the presentation and for the information, which I found incredibly fascinating, right? And I think you guys get a small taste of that. The board has seen the reports. the rest of the folks get a small taste when you can see the maps and just to see where the shifts and where the information is. So one of the big discussions that I think we have to have is about where do our kids attend school, right? What does school attendance look like? How do we make those determinations about who's where? We know, and again, looking at the reports, that there are some schools, and you guys hear about it here, that are really full. We have some schools that have empty seats, and a lot of empty seats. We know that as a district, when we maintain those hard class caps at the elementary level, typically we go into September, Mr. Bart, with 800, 900 empty seats at the elementary level across the 12 elementary schools. Now, those are not evenly distributed across the 12 schools, nor are they evenly distributed across kindergarten through 5th grade that's in there. But I do think that we need to go into a deeper discussion, with the board about what does it look like, where are kids going, how long are kids spending on buses. You can see that as Cherry Hill grew, and if you spend time with some of those maps, so that the Johnson attendance area is always a fascinating one, right? Because you can see where it spreads out and stretches out, and looks like different figures. What shape can you make that into that's on there? But as new developments and new home sales were developed, right, that the determination was like, well, you guys are going to go to Johnson. There's space at Johnson at that time, and that's when those determinations were made. But I think there needs to be a discussion. Now, I think that discussion needs to fit in with those three strategic goals that we have, right, that are guiding us during the course of these next 5 years. And I think that needs to be across the board, from elementary to middle to high school. How do we deliver the education that we deliver? You've heard me say it before, and the administrators all hear me say it all the time, right? My favorite John Dewey quote is, what knowledge is of most worth? And we may need to make that determination of what is most important and how do we do this. It's not a short discussion. It's not a short discussion at all. And I think it's something that needs to operate in a parallel fashion as we develop the referendum, because we are in a situation with these buildings that there is work that has got to be done, work that just absolutely has to be done. But as we're preparing for this referendum, I think we need to talk about what's our configuration, what's our organization, and where children are attending schools. It's not going to be the discussion that will be done in the fall. It's not a discussion that will be done by the 1st of next year. I will tell you that in my inclination, as we continue to progress, we're in March right now, as we progress through June and finalize the board's goals for June, as we get into July, I do think that this is a huge discussion that becomes part of the board goals as we move into the 2020-2021 academic year. That will then sound a foundation for what's it look like in 2021 and 22 if we're going to take action to make changes or adjustments about where children are attending. And we know right now, right? So we've been doing kindergarten registration. Mrs. Wethington, Dr. Mahan, Dr. Smith, Mr. Bart have been looking at the enrollments. Based on enrollment in some of the neighborhoods, we have kindergarten sections that are full. Right, it's March the 10th. We have kindergarten sections that are full. Dr. Grip's data, as he pointed it out, and I would agree with him. He's right. Right, as people come through, we find, depending upon the neighborhood, that there are many new families moving in with young children. Right, and we are just starting to see those kids, coming through the neighborhoods. It's one of the fascinating things as I visit schools, especially in the springtime, and you're riding around the neighborhoods after school to see the number of kids that are walking home and what our front yards look like to go through. So. There's absolutely a lot of a discussion that has to take place about how do we lay that out, but I think there are parallel paths that we go through.
Okay. If there's no further questions, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Malash. I'd actually like to thank Lynn Sugars as well for her help in getting me a lot of the data. There was a lot of stuff that had to come from your office, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Grip. Much appreciated, and safe travels home.
Yes, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay, and we have another presentation tonight, so I believe I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Sugars, who's going to present our preliminary budget.
Actually, I'm going to do that during the BNF committee report.
Because BNF was held in a closed session because of the information that was contained within that, there's really nothing that Mrs. Schultz would be able to report out when it comes time for the committee reports. So we just think as part of the regular discussion, we'll have Mrs. Sugars do it at that point. I want Mrs. Schultz to be able to have to say, well, I want to turn it to Mrs. Sugars. Here's my report, right? It's like a report at school, and you bring in somebody from the outside to be able to talk.
Okay, so then I will move into correspondence. Does anyone have any correspondence this evening to share?
Go ahead.
Mr. Avadia.
All right, first time First time for everything. Okay. I went to my first meeting of the Camden County Educational Services Commission on March 4th. It started at 7:30 p.m. It was lovely. I was sworn in. So the thing that sort of rose to the top of the agenda and frankly took the most time was Superintendent Del Vecchio talked about eSports. eSports. And the best probably visual is like a Tony Hawk, who's a skater, video game that Camden County Educational Services Commission would like to start a inter-school regional league starting September 1st. Interesting statistic, there are more high school students playing eSports than all other sports combined. So the idea here is to take a league that would be competitive. There are a lot of advantages. There's universal access where nearly anyone can compete, curriculum tie-ins, college and career interest paths. Rowan was mentioned as specifically interested. Social emotional health advantages, teamwork and team play, competition. There's something to the physicality of this called Alienware. I don't think it's made by aliens, but it's these high-performing computers. They're talking about taking the Echelon Mall, it's an idea, and creating an eSports rentable arena. It is not an inexpensive proposition. I kind of asked for something to take back. They said for 20 kids, for a district, for an entity, it would cost about $30,000 a year. And who knows? But so that's sort of in the rentable big space. I said though at one point, like, wouldn't we find a way to compete? We could compete against other countries. So anyway, so all of that is possible. This is something that seems pretty real from the way it's being described. And it was pretty interesting. There is the offer to present to us directly if we're interested in that. For this entity in the world of old business, they did a very good, They did a mental health summit that was totally subscribed and they had to turn people away. And the offer that they made to us and to other districts is to do small group work as follow-up to that summit that was apparently very well received. The one disappointing note of the and I tried not to take personal offense to it, but they decided that the nameplates would no longer be your name. The nameplates would rather reflect your district. Had I not been sworn in that night, it would have seemed like the overall course of business, but since I was the only one sworn in, it had a bit of a different flavor. So that was Camden County Educational Services Commission. I think this goes into correspondence, I don't know. But last Friday, I had a chance to sit down with, 3 classes in the district, the teachers, of course, and the students. I was with a kindergarten class at Kingston, a 4th grade class at Barton, and a 2nd grade class at Johnson for Read Across America. And all of them got Oh the Places You Go. The last 2, kind of a pro tip, had a second book ready for me, which turned out well. And the conversations were remarkably interesting about what a board member is, and it felt like a grilling session, like I was being interviewed, which I was, I guess. So finally, I said to the Johnson 2nd graders, I said, listen, there's public comment because we were on question number 30. And I said, listen, if you come, probably we would let you go first, too. So it is possible that they will come. And if they do, you may be hearing about robots that do homework as an idea, or a take your pet to school day that they would like to sanction. This is possible. But anyway, it was a lot of fun. And they were really, they were all very, very excited to learn. At one point, the kindergarten class at Kingston was talking about maybe we should extend the school day, and actually all the kids were for it. So it kind of took a different turn. So that's what I have to report.
Thank you, Mr. Abadia. Ms. Friedel, you had something you wanted to share.
Earlier this evening, I had the opportunity to join Ms. Matlack at the Cultural Proficiency meeting So it was my first time at the meeting and my first night presenting, so yay, me too. A really engaged group of individuals that are on this committee. There was some reports of some of the things that have been going on in the district. So, for example, for Black History Month, West did the Voice of West, is that correct? I'm trying to make my notes, where it was like a living history museum.
Yep, a living museum.
Yes. And they discussed some of the collaborations between High School West and Kilmer, where the high school students do some mentoring. And also, the alternative school does some mentoring type work with Carusi. Kingston had a very special visit. One of the grandfathers of one of the students was part of the civil rights movement and marched with Martin Luther King. And he came in and spoke with the students, so that was pretty exciting also. They went through some of the service learning projects at the schools that they will be discussing with Zone some of their goals, sharing the goals of the cultural proficiency meeting with Zone. There was a discussion about Holocaust Remembrance Day and a lot of dialogue between the difference between Holocaust Remembrance Day and Jewish History Month, and looking at if we are doing enough at the elementary school with what we're doing, and is the information that we're sharing factual and developmentally appropriate. That was another conversation. And Dr. Williams, who is a consultant who leads the group, did mention that she would be happy to do a presentation to the board if we are so inclined to have her.
I would just mention that we ended with working on the goals, each of the committees that, have their goals, that each goal, it has a committee that's responsible for it. And so at the end of each meeting, they discuss, where they are in those goals, where they are in the 5-year plan, what's coming up. So there was a breakout into that. And Dr. Williams also does a little bit of professional development with the committee each month that she's there. And she did that again, although the other discussions went on for a lot longer than she anticipated, so she had to cut her session down a little bit. But, she always gives us good material to look over at home. And, so it was great.
I'll just add one last thing, so all my notes. In April, the committee will actually be doing a World Cafe at West with students. So that will be an interesting meeting.
Anyone else? Mrs. Neary.
Yes, so on, I think it was March 5th, last Thursday, Fair Funding had met with the mayor's office. Missy Lang, Laurie Deach, Barbara Wilson, and myself sat in just to provide awareness to Mayor Angulo of what the group was, what they are doing, awareness in the history of Fair Funding, and just really about, creating a continued collaborative path forward, as it doesn't really go away. So, how we can stay engaged with our legislators, how they can help with that. It was a really positive meeting on moving forward and hoping to keep the community engaged and get them out and involved as well.
Thanks. Great, thank you. And I just have 2 quick items, sort of as a follow-up to Mrs. Neary's Fair Funding meeting. I also had an opportunity to attend the latest Fair Funding Committee meeting as representative from the board, and the discussion was primarily around the good news about our additional funding and making sure that we had an opportunity to say thank you for that additional funding, but not rest on our laurels going forward. So there was the additional talk was about the plan forward and sort of mobilizing the troops and getting us, thank you, and what are the next steps for that? Unfortunately, the meeting was not well attended, so I did let Lori Deach know that I would put the word out there when I read out at the meeting that they're always looking for people to be involved. And you can reach out to her, and I had her email address written down, but I don't have it with me at the moment, but I will get it to everybody, or their funding committee information is on our website, correct? And there's a link. So you can reach out via that link. And then the next fair funding meeting date is TBD, but fair funding will be represented there's an event at Malberg here later in the month, Parent University, and the fair funding group is going to be there and be available to talk to parents when they come in and share the fair funding message. So they were excited about that. And then the other quick thing that I wanted to mention, I also had the opportunity to read. I read to second graders and kindergartners at Thomas Paine. However, in the kindergarten class, my reception was not necessarily as warm at first because Mrs. Hafner introduced me as the person who made sure that they were in school and having fun in school. And so they all just were like, "You're the reason we're in school." And so they were not super thrilled to have me there at first. But then once I started reading, it was all great. So I always love reading to the kids. So that was a wonderful experience. Okay, and if no one else has anything to add, I suppose we will move right into our committee reports, and I will turn it over to Mrs. Matlack for curriculum and instruction.
Thank you very much. All right, we met on March 2nd at 5 o'clock, and we just had a couple items on our agenda that evening. The first was the summer reading. Board members have been given books to read that they want to add to the summer reading list, and the board members went through their book and talked about it, and some of the books were really well liked. Some of them, people are like, yeah, it was good, but they're all the books are definitely appropriate, age appropriate for and grade appropriate for the kids that were chosen. Keep in mind that we are adults reading the books that may be for a sixth grader, so the content may not be the same. And then two other books were introduced and given out to board members: The Girl Who Drank the Moon and Undefeated, Jim Thorpe and the Carlisle Indian School football team. Let's see, next we talked about the middle school scheduling. Dr. Smith reviewed the committee's recommendation for the new middle school scheduling, including the benefits of the schedule, the development process, anticipated staffing, and next steps. And that was all in the board's memo, the presentation. So you should have seen that and can read through that. We talked about Aaron's Law, the sexual abuse prevention training. Dr. Mahan provided an update on the mandatory legislation. All K-12 administrators, health and PE teachers, SACs, guidance counselors, and nurses were informed of the requirements, and the presentation will be posted on the website. The principals will distribute to parents via Blackboard. Let's see. We had two members of the public who commented on things, asking questions about the middle school schedule. Will it be like the high school? Will it rotate? And another question was about technology and given devices, and how instruction takes place for those devices, and a question about how the technology staff is used in our schools. That is it. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
So in looking at that presentation, for the changes regarding the technology curriculum, is that curriculum going to change? And what is the impact to the classes that'll absorb that if we remove that?
Dr. Mahan
Is your,
can best answer
is your
that.
question in regard to the middle level committee work? So I believe the recommendation on the slide is the elimination of the technology courses with the understanding that technology will be infused across all of the content areas moving forward. So the curriculum would in fact change because it would be infused across all content areas, and the current technology courses as designed would be eliminated.
Is that going to require them, like, professional development for the members that are teaching the current classes? I just wasn't unsure what that impact to absorbing it back into other classes looks like, even if it's different.
So yes, it'll probably involve some professional development that exists. The majority of the curricula, you know, and again, this looks at the evolution of curriculum and the program that we offer the students when they're in school, allows us to take the independent projects or what they would be working on in technology and become part of math or become part of science or become part of language arts or the humanities at the middle level. So there will probably be professional development that's included within that, but that will certainly involve, if there is, you know, that will go through Dr. Mahan's office as the curriculum for each of those courses is reevaluated.
Can I also add an additional comment? On one of the last slides towards the end, one of the things that Dr. Smith had highlighted in his presentation was that one of the subcommittees or areas for the middle level committee is, I want to read the exact wording, delineating how to integrate technology across subjects in place of technology as exploratory. So that is one of the areas that will be highlighted. So yes, professional development.
Okay, thanks.
So have we thought about what the unintentional consequences of this change would be as it pertains to particularly students? So some students who may need assistive technology and so forth, who is going to be providing that, or would that not impact those positions? The unintended consequences of our teachers who are certified or middle school for math or language arts, do they really have the background and capacity to fully integrate the technology in this way? I just, you know, not that I'm opposed to it, I just want to make sure that we're considering the unintentional.
Absolutely. So part of it is the ongoing discussion, right? So there's a piece that was introduced to the board, you know, a week ago to the C&I committee, being introduced to the full board tonight. You know, you all saw the presentation that's there. There'll be ongoing discussion at the building level. Then they'll look to form a committee, you know, similar to what Dr. Mahan did when we did the full day kindergarten, to seat that committee this spring, then to meet during the course of next fall and into the winter, and have different stakeholder groups that will be involved in those discussions. Unintended consequences are certainly something, absolutely, you're correct, Ms. Friedel, that we have to take a look at. In terms of assistive technology for students that are identified to have that assistive technology, that has nothing to do with these teachers, right? So that would be a standalone that would go through Mrs. Wethington's office and different staff that would be involved. Do the teachers have the wherewithal to incorporate this? So we believe that they do. You know, some of that, we're in the second year of the teachers having their own devices that we've issued to them. You know, the use of whether it's Google Classroom or the different software packages, you know, in the application of those. So yes, we do believe that they have the wherewithal to do it. Some of that has started gradually over the last year and a half with what we've asked them to do from when they were originally distributed to how are they included in class, how are they instructional tools, you know, what does that look like? There will always probably be a need for ongoing training with technology. You know, and if you recall, we still run what we refer to as flex option training. You know, one of the professional development days that our certificated staff are expected to complete during the course of the year. Typically, they can sign up for an after-school workshop. It becomes embedded, you know, because it's done 3 times in 2-hour sessions. That is often with technology. You know, when we first did implementation of the smart boards 10 years ago or so in round numbers, there was a lot of training that went on with staff for the use of smart boards. Now that we have the interactive flat panels, there's a lot of training that's going on with that. That's a regular course of something that we would include. And then it can also be done at the building level specific as well. So good questions.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Matlack. So, Ms. Schultz, would you like to turn the meeting over to Mrs. Sugars?
Well, yes, I would.
So we did also meet in closed session. It's becoming our new thing. But we are getting a lot accomplished. So while Ms. Sugars is getting set up, I will let everyone know that we are meeting again, March 30th. That's going to be in closed session, so I'd welcome you to attend, but unfortunately you can't.
Hold on a second. Icon has disappeared. Okay. Tonight we are going to talk about the 2020-21 school year budget. This is the first step in the process of approving our budget. This is the initial submission budget. It's actually a two-step process that we'll talk about in a minute. So our initial submission budget, which is due to the county office by March 20th, since we're having our board meeting tonight on March 10th, we're approving it tonight. Once we submit it, the county office reviews and approves. Oh, sorry. And then once they review and approve it, then we can proceed with the public hearing. Public hearing has to be held between April 24th and May 7th. Currently, the public hearing is scheduled for our April 28th Board of Education meeting. So once we get through the public hearing, we have board approval of the budget, and then we no longer go through an election process. We can move ahead and start planning for the next year. So tonight we're going to talk about the funds that make up our annual budget. The general fund, which is the largest, it's Fund 10. It's the day-to-day operations of the district. We also have the special revenue fund, which is Fund 20, and that's for federal, state, and local grants. And then we also normally have the debt service fund, Fund 40, which is the payment of principal and interest on bonds, but currently we are debt-free, so we don't have the Fund 40 component in our budget this year. So what are some of the highlights of our 2021 budget? So we will be hiring some additional positions, and that will include a technology education teacher, a technology coach position, 2 additional English as a second language teachers, a floating nurse position. We have a difficult time finding substitute nurses, so this position will aid us in that and will be offset by some of the costs that we'll save. It's also very expensive to get substitute nurses. Continued funding of our technology plan. Last school year, we refurbished Kilmer. This year, we're going to do Mann and the annex wing of Kingston. Upgrades to the Beck Media Center, and then hiring a grant writer as a contracted service as opposed to an employee. In terms of capital items, through the capital reserve, we'll be setting aside funds for ADA compliance, some HVAC replacements, and then we're very excited to talk about finishing off some of our security projects, finishing off cameras in all of the schools, and then also through the capital outlay, the swipe card access in all of the schools. We will be receiving, hopefully, from the state, securing our children's future grant funds, $608,000 that we will use to offset some of these costs. And therefore, we decided when we were looking at various projects that we would move ahead with those two to implement those programs in the remaining schools that currently do not have the cameras and the swipe card access.
So we will budget for the full amount and then go through the reimbursement process. And the reason we're going to budget for the full amount is because it's still kind of up in the air what the reimbursement process looks like. However, when we receive those funds, we can offset those costs. We will also continue with the security vestibules. We'll get to do a middle school at this point. We've done the 2 high schools, which should be done very shortly. We've done some of the elementary schools, so we felt it was time to do one of the middle schools, and we're going to start with Beck. Also, flooring and asbestos removal throughout the district in various locations. East classroom refurbishment as part of the wall project that we're doing over there. We will refurbish some of the classrooms that are being worked on as part of that project. Paving throughout the district, some athletic field upgrades, and then continuing fencing. We did a large fencing bid this year and did quite a few projects, and we will continue the fencing work, which there's a multitude of need throughout the district. So those are some of the highlights. So when we talk about our budget, we break our budget down into a couple different broad categories. Each of these categories are broken down into much smaller pieces, but when we're looking at the educational costs, we break our budget down between regular education, special education, basic skills and bilingual, extracurricular and athletics, and then other instructional programs. And so you can see between the current budget year of this year of 1920 and the proposed budget for next year of 2021, we'll have an increase in that category of just over $4 million, or 4.8%. And then if we look more at our operational costs, which is the other side of the budget, includes things like out-of-district tuition, student services, which includes nurses' offices, guidance offices, child study team, those type of things. Instruction and media would be curriculum writing, professional development, and our media centers. Administration would include principal's offices, superintendent's office, business office, technology office. Facilities and security is maintenance, custodial, grounds, and security. Transportation is obviously transportation. And in that area of categories in support and operational, we will actually see a decline of about $670,000, or 0.6%. So rounding out our general fund budget, we also have our capital outlay, and that would include equipment, construction, capital reserve, and then our SDA assessment. The construction and capital reserve equipment we talked about. The SDA assessment is actually a fee that we pay back to the state every year for previous SDA grant funds that the district had received. We have to pay towards the interest on those grant funds. So capital outlay is going down significantly, and the main reason that's going down so much is, as you notice there, the capital reserve transfer. In the 1920 school year, we had appropriated a lot of money out of the capital reserve account to address some of the issues that we were experiencing at East. We will be backing off of the withdrawal from capital reserve down to $2.4 million. The rest of our capital projects will come out of capital outlay, the $3.8 million number. And so the significant decrease that we see in that budget is due to using less capital reserve funds this year. So overall, you can see that our total general fund budget is decreasing just over $1 million, from $217 million to $216 million. But a significant part of that decrease is the capital reserve amount, the lesser amount that we're using this year. So overall, about a 0.5% decrease in the budget. If we look at that graphically, again, regular education, special education, basic skills and bilingual, and extracurricular and athletics is making up about 53% of our budget, and the remaining items, which are more support and operational, make up the remainder 47% of our budget. If we look at that again in a different way, because we are very much a people-driven organization, 72% of the budget goes to salary and benefits, and 28%, the remainder, covers everything else that isn't salaries and benefits. So if we look on the other side now and we look at our revenues, we can see here that our local tax levy will be increasing $5.7 million. This is our 2% budget cap that we're allowed to increase. In addition, We had a spending growth limitation adjustment, which means that we can increase our cap beyond the 2% of 1.27%. That was due to enrollment. Generally, we got one due to health benefits. This year, we got one because of enrollment. So it includes both the spending growth limitation adjustment and the 2% tax levy increase. The other revenues pretty much stayed about the same year over year. So the big increase in that category is the tax levy. That's our local revenues. If we look at our state aid, we spoke earlier about the fact that we did see a significant increase in our aid. You can see there that that came in the form of equalization aid. That jumped from $7.8 million to $11.2 million for an overall increase of just about $3.5 million. So we were very pleased to see that and hope that that trend continues. Extraordinary aid at the bottom there, that is, as you know, from previous year's budget presentation, that aid is actually aid that we don't know about until further into the school year. And what I mean about that is we actually apply for extraordinary aid every year, and we haven't even done the application for 1920 yet. We do that in May generally. So we tend to be conservative in how much we include in the budget for that number. It's a 1920 fiscal year for us revenue. It's a 2021 fiscal revenue for the state. So we always like to be careful with that, make sure that they appropriate as much as they say they're going to. So that number we generally set around $1 million, and we did the same in this year's budget as well. And then our remaining revenues, federal aid, which is our reimbursements, fund balance, which comes out of our reserves. We backed off on that number. We had been using quite a bit of fund balance over the past couple years. Capital reserve, again, you can see that we backed off of that number. And again, the budget is just a little over $1 million less than it was in the 1920 school year. So again, if we look at that graphically, you can tell that between tax levy of 84%, capital reserve of 1%, and fund balance of 3%, that the district is pretty much funding 88%. Local revenues are funding 88% of the budget, with the remaining 11% of our budget coming from the state, 1% coming from miscellaneous revenue and tuition, and then the federal aid is such a small amount it didn't even come up as a percentage. So that's what our revenues look like from that standpoint. And again, the second component of the budget is special revenue fund. This is state, local, federal grants. Our biggest grants in this fund are the title grants and IDEA. Other grant funds tend to be non-public state funds that actually aren't ours. We're just the pass-through for our non-public schools, chef grants that we receive, other things like that go through the other grant fund section. We don't know what those numbers are at this point. We never know what they are going into the budget, so we generally budget about 85% of what the number was the previous year, and that's how we're guided by the state. So at this point, we're just using those numbers until we know exactly how much money we're going to get. Typically, we use IDEA funds primarily for tuition, out-of-district tuition, and the other funds we use for professional development and teacher salaries. So the estimated tax impact on an average assessed home of $225,000 is $164.59. Last year, excuse me, you may recall it went down because we had the debt service aid drop off. We had an increase in ratables. This year we're going to have an increase. Any questions? Mrs. Friedel.
So when I look at your document, there's salaries and other. Is other like materials, supplies? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Transportation, utilities,
Okay.
tuition, anything that isn't a salary or benefit.
Can I just highlight just briefly, and I apologize for them not making it onto the slides. There are 2 additional positions that I want to highlight that are being added. One is going to be in the HR office, another HR professional that will split time between working in this building and working over at the Buildings and Grounds facility to have some more direct contact with our maintenance, support staff, cleaners, custodians. to go through. And the second is a director level position that will deal in issues of compliance and equity. We haven't titled it yet, but it'll take over the administration of the HIB, affirmative action, Title IX. We'll work with staff doing professional development, work with staff throughout the district on issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, things like that as well. So as we come up, we'll be going through the HR committee to define what that job is to go through. And also just one of the things that, as Mrs. Sugars pointed out, so the technology teacher that's being added, we were just had the discussion about technology at the middle school. It's actually at the high school level because that may come up as a question. Right now we have one technology teacher that's split between the two high schools. So each of the high schools will have a full-time technology teacher. Dr. Mahan, through the curriculum office, will work with the folks at the high school, actually revising curricula in that area. There's been a great demand, so we're looking to respond to that. And I'm very excited about the technology coach position. So we have teacher coach positions throughout the district. At the elementary level, we have literacy coaches, all 12 of the elementary schools. There's one math literacy coach at the elementary. Then there's a secondary coach for mathematics and a secondary coach for literacy. And then we have a math science across the district position as well. And then we're going to add this technology position. So I'm very excited about that, again, because of the rollout of what we've done with staff over the last couple of years with technology, what we're asking them to do and what we're asking the students to do. So we're looking for somebody that is quite adept, and current with what's going on in that world.
So tonight, we're just voting so the budget can get submitted by the deadline of March 20th, but we will have some ongoing discussions as you develop the full budget?
I mean, typically the budget doesn't change between the initial submission and the public hearing, other than maybe the county will come back and say, we need you to change this or we need you to do that, but certainly it can change if it needs to.
All right, so then I want to know, have we looked at shared services? So like paving was up on the list of some of the projects to be done. So have we looked at shared services with the township on cost effectiveness of that?
Yeah, we absolutely have. We've done several projects with them, paving projects. We've done a lot of tree work with them. And actually one of the things that we need to submit to the county is a list of our shared services. So we do quite a few things with them. We have actually a very good, particularly with the Public Works Department and our Facilities Department, we have a very good working relationship. We buy salt from them. We buy other items from them. We have a relationship with them in terms of the police department when they provide supplemental for games and those kinds of things. So yeah, I think we also, when we look at shared services, we purchase our electricity and gas through a statewide consortium of other school districts. So we do that with them. We belong to a lot of purchasing consortiums throughout the state. So the more buying power you have, the better the deal you get. So we participate in them every opportunity that we have.
I have a question.
Sure.
Under security, what does security cover? Is that the cameras and everything that you mentioned in the goals?
So under security, that is specifically the personnel that are in the
personnel.
security department. Any kind of software, supplies, clothing, uniforms, travel, PD, all those kinds of things fall under that.
And the HVAC, is that, what is going on? Is that based on like energy efficiency models that would be replacing that system, or?
Yeah, it would be that it's typically like for like. We're talking about rooftop units that have come to the end of their life, and so anything that we replace is going to be in much more technologically advanced than what we had up there. So yes, anything that we install will definitely be more energy efficient than the 10 to 15, 20-year-old stuff we have up there now.
Okay, Thank you very much.
Welcome.
So next, I'll ask Mrs. Tong to move the HR agenda to do her HR committee report. Sorry.
All right, so we discussed about the substitute rate in order for us to stay competitive with other school districts and the CHEA negotiation. And looking forward to recruitment of the 20 and 21 for more teachers. We don't have all the details at this time. So I guess when we do, we will let you know. The next HR meeting is April 14th.
Thank you, Mrs. Tong. Next, we're going to discuss policy and legislation. I'm going to ask Ms. Friedel to discuss that in Mrs. Nere's absence.
Thank you. So on March 2nd, the Policy and Legislation Committee met. We got a legislative update from Dr. Smith that the free and reduced lunch legislation passed. Basically, what that means is that children who are on reduced lunch will now get free meals at the schools. He also, for policy and regulation, he shared, it wasn't up for a vote, but just to kind of do a review of the field trip policy, which came out of a waiver that needed to be presented for the DECA trip. So it was a really nice presentation to really understand the intricacies of the field trip policies. We did then get into a discussion of the 8th grade DC trip, which was an overnight trip, but will be moving to a day trip for each of the schools. So all 3 middle schools will be going, but it will be a day trip. So we had a lot of just dialogue on what they would get out of a day versus the overnight. We also, let me see. We did talk about the piece of the policy that talks about equitable allocation, and that the anchor trips are by grade level. And Dr. Malash was going to share the the anchor trips with us. But it does not necessarily stop other options for other trips that schools may take. Let's see. We then just went into comment. We did discuss whether the board should discuss if we need to look at a therapy dog policy, since the service dog policy is ADA related and is a dog that comes into the schools as part of an IEP where people do not touch the dogs. They are there for the service of the student versus a therapy dog, which is there for the purpose of interaction with the students. We had a couple of comments, public comments. Dr. Potowitz talked about the state aid. He gave us a lot of information historically on Cherry Hill situation with state aid figures. One of the things that he did share was there was a New Jersey Spotlight article, and Ms. Sugars, correct me if I misheard him, we were the 33rd highest increase in state aid this year. Okay, yeah, around there. But what he wanted to point out that while we were like the 33rd highest in the state, we were the 133rd district for the per pupil allocations. So to just look at 33 as like, oh, they got all this money, we're not 33 in the per pupil allocations. We also had some public comment, and I'm sorry, I'm not finding them. I think that's it. Sorry.
Thank you. Okay. Now, I just want to have Dr. Malash jump in for a second related to P&L and talk a little bit about our continuity of learning plan.
Thank you, Mrs. Seidel. So there's been a lot of discussion about coronavirus, COVID-19, in our community and our country and our world. It's something that we've spent a lot of time over the last few weeks discussing as a school district. One of the most intense part of the discussions recently has been about developing a plan for continuity of learning. So one of the questions that was put forward through the Department of Health, both in Camden County, the state level, and to the Department of Ed, is what does it look like if we have to close schools down and if schools have to be closed for an extended period of time? Can we maintain a continuity of learning where we have opportunities for children to continue to progress in their studies, and that we don't lose this dramatic amount of time? Because it is all so new, there's a certain amount that's reactionary by the state and by the departments, for sure, because of what we are dealing with. But again, as a school district, we are structured and we are planners in terms of what takes place. So I shared with the board last night, the draft of our action plan for continuity of learning. Ultimately, after we talk about it a little bit tonight, we will share an executive summary of what's contained in there that'll be available for the community to see. Our school district is prepared should we be directed by the Department of Health that we have to close a school or all of our schools. We will not be closing our schools or altering our school calendar unless there is a directive from the Department of Health. Okay, we will not be doing that. Part of our program and what we've determined is best for the 11,000 or so kids in our 19 schools in our community is to maintain the structure and the organization of how our 19 buildings run on a regular schedule. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen both in the press or on social media or other places, there are some school districts that have closed to do preparation, right, where they're having the teachers prepare lessons, or schools that are doing early dismissals for the teachers to prepare lessons. We do not believe that it's in the best interest of our children to adjust our schedules in that manner. And honestly, we believe that our teachers are prepared to be able to maintain a continuity of learning with electronic lessons that we can prepare and that we can provide. So we met as a superintendent's council yesterday with some additional input. We met with the full administrative team in the district today. The administrators will be meeting with the staff in their buildings tomorrow, going through, again, these ongoing layers of discussion. We issued all of our staff members, and I've talked about it a couple times tonight, electronic devices, Chromebooks at the elementary level, laptops at the secondary level, and have expected the staff to use those as in an instructional manner during the course of the last year and a half. We're going to expect them to be able to do that as well should we have to close schools. Through Google Classroom. There may be a little bit different at the preschool. Mrs. Wethington and Mrs. Rockhill will be discussing that, and information will be shared directly with those parents. But we will have information and opportunities for the kids to learn should we have to be closed. We have on our website, Mrs. Wilson and the technology department have been very thorough over the last week or so, in terms of posting the information. I've done a memo and a message to the community probably once a week, probably more often as there's more information that's timely right now that's all contained within there. We did a brief video yesterday afternoon, a little more than 4 minutes. I couldn't say this has been a minute because it hadn't just been a minute and we couldn't squeeze it all in. And poor Mrs. Wilson, as she films, she always waves her pinky at me to let me know that we're almost out of time. We did a brief video just to let folks know that we are working on this. This is something that is requiring and receiving quite a bit of attention, required work throughout the course of the weekend by the central administrative team, to prepare the information that we put forward yesterday. Again, our goal is to maintain the continuity of what is going on and not to disrupt families, not to disrupt the community unless we are directed to do so. If we have to close schools and that takes place, then schools will be closed. As soon as we know that, we will communicate that. We will use the same methodology that we do if it were to be a snow day. We'll do the robocalls will go out, we'll update our websites and the school websites, we'll update social media. That information will be put out. If we know that we're going to be closed for multiple days, that information will be shared as soon as we know it. As soon as we have that, and it's in a format that we can share with the public, we will share it with the public. We don't want people hanging out there not knowing what's going to go on. In my message yesterday, and then in a direct email out to all the families in the district, I encourage parents just to make arrangements, prepare for arrangements in case their children, schools are closed, for whatever that looks like and takes place. SAC will not open if we are closed. That will not happen. We put out a survey, we sent an email, same thing, out to everyone asking about electronic access. If families have internet access at home, and if they have a keyboard-enabled device, because we do believe a keyboard-enabled device is important at home with assignments that will be sent, if they have that access accessible at home. One of the things, because people asked today about it, is that we have a list of families that we already know that do not have devices or internet access at home. Paper copies, and a list went to each one of the principals, paper copies of the survey. We're going home directly with the children to those schools. I will tell you that we also know that about 96% of our parents we know are able to access our website and Genesis, the student portal, with the use of their smartphones. So even folks, there's a number of folks that do not have the technology at home or that it's usable for their children, but we do know from the data that we maintain in terms of the use of the parent portal that about 96% of our families have access, a parent has access through a smartphone. So we have gotten a lot of responses. If we are going to be closed for a period of time, we will have opportunity for those families to sign out devices. They will be able to pick up Chromebooks. What that looks like, it depends on when we receive that information, that a school or the district is going to be closed, when we receive it, and what schools it's impacting. If we found out tonight at 8:30 that there was a reason that we were being directed to close our schools tomorrow, we're not going to be able to get people devices tonight, right? It's just not going to happen. Probably not tomorrow either. But there is a plan in place that we are able to distribute devices from any one of our facilities, right? It involves some central folks, it involves the technology teams, it involves moving the devices into those spots so that they can be borrowed by the families. We have information to share with them about internet access. We've received contacts from some of the local providers. We can provide that information as well, especially should this take place, to go through. We've been in discussions with Aramark, who's our food service provider, about what does it look like? Are we going to be able to provide meals? What does, again, depends upon what the impact is, what if a school or what schools have to be closed, what that looks like, what the impact is. More information with that will come out when we know what's going on. There's a certain amount of fluidity that will exist with the plan, again, depending upon what the circumstances are. But I just want to kind of update all of you on what the discussions are that we are having. We had some great questions from principals this afternoon. And like I say, they're back, either this afternoon or starting tomorrow. We'll be meeting with their staff about what those plans look like. We've expected over the last year and a half that teachers were using these electronic devices. They all had to, was it Dr. Mahan last year, to be able to use Google Classroom, kids be able to log in and to do an assignment. So we'll be doing those follow-ups. Some of the things we'll be reminding parents to do is to check and make sure that they have access to the parent portal to go through, right? Because again, there's a way that we can reset passwords. What that looks like, at least if there's an initial closure, will still kind of be up in the air. So that's where we are with our plan. We've submitted the plan to the county office. It's an informational item for the board. As the continued updates are available, we'll put them out there. Mrs. Wilson and some folks spent time working on an FAQ today that is also posted. You can find all of it on the front page of our website, or links on the front page of our website. That also is dynamic information that we will continue to update as questions come in. If folks have questions, as I said in the message yesterday, we always hope that they ask us directly. It allows us to answer them directly, but we will continue to update each one of those pieces. I'm thinking Dr. Mann, Ms. Wethington, Ms. Adrian, Ms. Sugars, pretty much covers the last 72 hours of our lives. Yes, Mr. Goodwin.
I just have a couple questions. So first, I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. If we are directed to close schools, we will not be making those days up unless we are also directed to make those days up, correct?
So that, yes, Mr. Gordon, that's a good question. So that's the intention of this continuity of learning plan. So the state has indicated if we have a continuity of learning plan that allows for learning to continue with the students, that they have that opportunity to do that we will be able to count it as one of the 180 days that's required by the state.
Second question, and I don't know if I guess it doesn't necessarily matter per se, but I'm curious, if we're closing the schools, would that mean that the teachers would also not be meeting in the schools? They would be from home, or how would that work?
Correct. So the way that we are looking at it right now, with an initial closure, again, depending upon what we are told by the Department of Health when they make that directive, is if we were to close the entire district, nobody would be reporting for work. We would work out the details of what does it mean to bring a group in if there's a specific spot that needs to be cleaned, contracting, bringing folks in to clean that, and then what does it look like for staff after that. But no, with this plan, the intention is that staff could work from home. They would be working from home. And if it is, because we would expect them, my directive to the staff is not to create 14 days of lessons, to have canned 14 days of lessons, because that really does not necessarily maintain continuity of learning for kids. But if we're counting as a day of school, we'll expect that staff will be able to update their Google Classroom, post assignments on a daily basis as we're going through it.
So the staff would be reporting electronically,
Electronically, correct.
But not at the
Not at
actual
the building,
schools.
correct.
Okay.
Imagine I have a question. Actually, a couple. I just want to make sure, clarification. Preschool and potentially even kindergarten really wouldn't be appropriate for online learning. So Mrs. Wethington and Dr. Mahan are working on what that would look like for those students?
Yes, so taking a look at what the developmentally appropriate activities could be, which could be a combination of both something that's downloadable by a parent that could be used and something that is active, and live on a screen. And when they're preparing the assignments, so we are not looking for them to prepare hours worth of assignments on a daily basis at any grade level, right? We're talking about looking at 20 minutes of an active assignment or so, and then what follow-up would be there to go in. But Mrs. Wethington, Mrs. Rockhill, the staff at the Early Childhood Center, Dr. Mahan looking about what does that look like. For K1 and 2 or for K1, they had some discussions today among the elementary principals about what type of assignments could they provide, right, in terms of continuing. One of the biggest things, and we will tell people this all along, is reading, having the kids read. The Mrs. McCartney, who's the district language curriculum supervisor, and she focuses primarily on language arts. We've told them, especially as kids come into the libraries in our elementary schools right now, if they want to take out an extra book, let them take an extra book or two. Right? That's not a bad thing for kids to take additional books to go out, but that will be a part of it for sure.
So then another question, which is actually a little bit, I guess, broader than the plan, but there's so many intricacies to this virus and the things that happen. So my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is, for example, the school buses. We contract with them, but do we share buses with other districts?
I believe so.
Yeah.
During the course of the day, I can't tell you how many
Right,
of them
so-
across the vendors,
So
but
I
yes.
guess, is there a plan for communication with those districts so that we're alerted or they're alerted? So, if, man bus number 7 had a child who, parent passed, is there a communication plan so that the bus company or someone would alert that other district that this bus has been exposed?
Yes, I can tell you, one piece will probably come from the transportation company. The other one, honestly, is from the Department of Health. Especially, and like you say, there's a level of intensity that exists right now because of the question and the concern that is out there. And they're incredibly thorough in terms of what their follow-up is about contact, who's been where, who is it, what's that look like. We've been in regular contact with the lead nurse, Dr. Smith, with the county health department and with the county health officer. So it's a pretty intense follow that they will do in terms of notification.
Right. Okay, thank you.
I'm just wondering, is there a different standard, or is the standard the same for extracurricular activities? Just saw Legally Blonde, fantastic show. But, obviously there are a lot of events planned. It involves a ton more people in the same space.
Yes. So right now, while we are open, all of that continues. Sports practices are continuing. High School East basketball team competed down in Atlantic City this afternoon. The shows are going to be on. Class trips are still going as scheduled, including, the Cartacure, you guys leave on Thursday next week for senior trip, is still going. And these are all direct questions that we literally have asked the Department of Health. People asked about Florida, asked about trips. No, there are no travel restrictions for domestic travel right now. There's nothing to, no reason for us not to do that. Again, depending upon what the Department of Health directs us, if it's a school or the district, would then impact those extracurricular activities. If we are closed as a district, then extracurricular activities would cease as well during that time. There wouldn't be practices, there wouldn't be meetings, there wouldn't be the show going up on stage, that kind of stuff. If it's not the entire district, then that's a discussion that we will have once that information is released to us by the Department of Health. And I agree. If you haven't seen Legally Blonde, Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday afternoon this weekend. It's fantastic. It really is very powerful. The high school East kids doing it in the West Auditorium.
Can I piggyback onto Mr. Avadia's question? So right now, if anything is getting canceled, it's because the organizer is canceling it. It's not being canceled on our end.
Good question, Mr. Friedel. Yes, if something's being canceled, it's not because the district has canceled it. It's because there's an outside group that has canceled something. So for instance, we have a group of kids who will go to the DECA Nationals in Maria next week, the following week, 2 weeks, the end of March, right? So there's, in round numbers, 50 kids or so that have qualified from our high schools, and there's still, that program is continuing. The DECA, the national organization, has not canceled it. So as long as they're running it, again, and there's no restrictions, the guidelines have not changed about what we are doing, we're going to continue to do that. And part of it is, right, so, and this is why we are not looking to adapt our schedule in terms of PD for the teachers, is to maintaining normalcy, right, for our community, for Cherry Hill, for our kids, for families. And like I said, one of the neighboring districts, which is a high school district, they're changing their schedule. Well, it's different when I have to look at how's it impact the preschool kids or the kindergarten kids or who's going home. It's a different discussion in terms of what takes place.
So if we were to close schools down, so how the high schools have the rotating day schedules, would the teachers be posting assignments based on those rotating day schedules or no?
Maria, that's a great question. They would not. They would just be posting on a daily basis with the information that goes through. I think you would see, and we'll probably get that question. We'll come back from the high schools tomorrow once they've gone back and talked to them about it, but to see what that looks like. One of the other questions that came up, honestly, from the high school folks is, all right, so looking for continuity of learning, we're going to post these assignments. What about AP, right? So I would expect that AP teachers, and the majority of the AP teachers that I have direct interaction with on a pretty regular basis, are pretty adept at using Google Classroom and posting that information. I'm going to expect that information is probably going to continue to be posted, in the same normal time frame as it would be, just because we have not heard from College Board that they're going to adapt that testing schedule, nor do I expect that they will, right? Because again, you figure when they are testing in the beginning of May, the majority of schools in the country are just about done, to go through. So I don't expect that they will push it back into June. I'd be shocked, if College Board chose to do that. Especially because all the checks have already been paid. Remember, we had to pay earlier this year and all. But good question. One of the other things there's no reason for parents out there or to start contacting teachers. Do you have lessons ready? Is this ready to go? Right? Teachers will provide that information. We will push that. As I said, Mrs. Wilson and I will continue to push information out from the district level, and then they will also receive information individually from buildings, and then filter down from teachers, once that ultimately hits that piece.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Malash. So I will update everybody on our last strategic planning committee meeting, which was held on Monday, March 2nd at 8 p.m. We are coming to the finish line of our school building reviews. As everyone knows, we've been covering several buildings per strategic planning meeting. And at the last meeting, we covered Cooper and Rosa, and I'll just give you some highlights from the meeting. The full presentation was in your packet, so you should be able to review that. So Cooper was born in 1970 with additions in 2000, and there are currently 218 students enrolled. Over the past 2 years, some of the projects that have been completed are roof leak repairs and parking lot paving. Some of the more current projects are ADA stage access, which is actually completed, main entrance security cameras, fence work, and roof leak repairs. And then future projects are the security suite, toilet room alterations, HVAC replacement, interior doors and locks, which you've been hearing me talk about across all the schools we've discussed so far, replace steel lintels, small group instruction upgrades. We talked a little bit about how Cooper is probably one of our most well-maintained schools in the district. It's actually in really, really good shape. Then we moved on to talk about Rosa. Established in 1961 with additions in 1999 and an enrollment of 800 students. Over the past 2 years, we've completed roof leak repairs, exterior doors, and roof vent replacements. Current projects underway are the main entrance security cameras and additional roof leak repairs. And then for future projects for Rosa, the security suite, including the vestibule, asbestos abatement, small group instruction space, interior doors and locks, replace curtain wall, accessibility, and adding a cafeteria with a stage is one of the bigger projects for Rosa. And we will finish out with the last 2 schools. We will cover West on May 5th and East on June 2nd. So then Dr. Malash gave us an update on the strategic planning process. And the first thing we talked about was how Dr. Grip was going to be sharing the demographic survey with us tonight, which he did. And then we talked about the next steps for the strategic goals that we've been talking about over the past several months. So what's going to happen, and again, we'll be talking about this a lot over the foreseeable future. So committees have been formed to work on action plans for each of the 3 strategic goals. There's a representative from all 19 schools are participating on at least one of the committees. There will be a certificated staff member and an administrator co-chairing each committee. These groups will, looks like they already met with yesterday. They all met with Miss Judy Wilson on March 9th, and then they'll meet individually with their committees. The plan is for there to be 9 members on each committees, and most of the original staff members that worked on the goals have committed to participating in these committees. So that's great news because that shows that they really valued the work that was done and are interested in being part of the process moving forward. So that was great. So as a board, we can expect to see their action plans in May or June with their ideas, and then we'll see that in May or June with the expectation and hope that the board can adopt those action plans later at the end of June. And then the adoption of those goals then sort of lead us into our goal making for 2020, 2021 for future goals and for our larger strategic plan. And Dr. Malash also gave us a brief update on the Safety and Security Committee meetings and the Alternative Funding Committee meetings, which we've been talking about also. And we expect we will have both those committees will do their final presentations and recommendations to the board next month. No, May? Right, that's right. We have committee of the whole, May. Those presentations will be made to the board in May. Sorry. We had just a very small amount of public comment. A community member inquired about the enrollment at Cooper, additional educational spaces at Rosa, and non-certificated staff involvement in strategic planning. Yep, go ahead.
And just a reminder again for everybody, and I appreciate Mrs. Seidel did a great job with updating. The three strategic goals, right, fall into 3 separate categories. One is student wellness, one is purpose and passion, and one is connecting beyond our classrooms, right, with more language that goes underneath each of those. Purpose and passion, student wellness, connecting beyond our classrooms, right? So those are those 3 areas that are going to guide us as we put the work that Dr. Grip did for us into the discussion, as we look forward to these action plans that will come out from these dynamic committees that I'm very excited about. This is what's going to continue us as we move forward, right? This is the sustainability piece for us as a district for the next 5 years.
Are there any questions about strategic planning? Mrs. Matlack.
I don't have a question about strategic planning. I would just like to backtrack a little bit and offer my thanks to Dr. Malash and the administrative team for all the work you've put in the past couple of days to put in place this continuity of learning plan. When it was given to the board and we saw the detail that was involved in it, we are well aware. When the community sees the plan, they will be well aware of the amount of thought and deliberation and concern that went into it. So thank you for all the work you did for that.
Thank you, Mrs. Matlack. And I would agree. Thank you very much to administration. So next we're going to move into our first public comment. There will be 2 opportunities for public comment this evening. The first public comment session is for agenda items only. There will be another public comment for any topic at the end of the meeting. If you would like to speak now, please identify the agenda item, speak into the microphone, and clearly state your name and address. Each speaker will be given a maximum of 3 minutes to speak. The timer on the screen behind me will indicate the amount of time you have remaining.
Hi, Jen Nadio, 224 North Madison Avenue. I don't have a copy of the agenda, but I'm going to go with what was just discussed, so I'm going to guess that that's part of it. So the budget, the question I have is, it did say ADA compliance on there, but there wasn't any specifics on what exactly is being fixed. So we would really like to know that. I don't know when you can give that to me, because I realize there's still some legal things going on with it. But if it's on this budget that's going to be approved, I would like to be able to see what's there. As far as the COVID-19, special education students who might be in self-contained classrooms may not be taught at the same level as everyone else. And so the question that I have is, will they have a specific curriculum on a computer, or will they be instructed to do the reading like preschool, kindergarten, and first grade? Because especially if they're nonverbal, they may not be able to communicate with their parents unless they already have maybe their iPads for their talkers, right? So those were my 2 questions so far. Oh, the other thing was, as far as the transportation is concerned, yes, the answer is yes, because my own son attends a school that is not in Cherry Hill. He's out of district and he is in Willingboro. That school bus also visits the other, actually some Cherry Hill schools. So I fully understand the health department piece personally. So I realize that we are following them, right? But that is a major concern. Our out-of-district students come from, when they go into their school, they're coming from all over. Some come from out of state. So we just have to be vigilant of that. And it was just something that I was like, wait a minute, let me bring that up tonight. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing. I think that the plan is pretty comprehensive. I just wanted to make sure that the special ed piece was discussed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Nadio.
Hi, Rick Short, 1002 Chelton Parkway. Thank you, Cherry Hill School District. Thank you, well, the board so far yet. The addition of the cameras to all the remaining schools. That's great news. I do have a question. I guess this is more for Ms. Sugars. I think you mentioned $603,000. Was that from the state bond, from the New Jersey state bond? That money? Okay, thank you, sir. But I think one thing you might have missed was that panic alarms are also in this. I just wanted to clarify that. Also, and again, I'm not a budget expert, so this is more, I guess, up Mrs. Sugar's alley. Did we use the 1.9 million in bank cap that's still available? And if we didn't use the 1.9 million, is there any advantage to the taxpayers that we would be saving money if we used the bank cap before the bond? And could we do other projects with the 1.9 million in bank cap? So again, I'm not a budget expert. And just for the school board people, or another one for Mrs. Sugars would be, I think the subsection under the security of 11.00.266, like, is that just a general question I can ask the board or Ms. Sugars and she can get back to me, or do I have to oper it? Because what that does is that breaks down more of the security funds. I do know, I believe this is correct, is that $631,000 was spent for security salaries. In 2019, it looks like it was $336 for 2018, and I'm going to expand on that when the open comments come. So I really just have 3 questions. One is to confirm the panic alarms, and also the bank capped, if there's any tax advantages to our taxpayers in Cherry Hill on that, and then that subsection of the breakdown of where it goes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Short.
Yoni Iyer, 329 Cherry Hill Boulevard. This is about Dr. Griff's presentation. One of those hotspots for birth area and growth is in the Jewish community, and a lot of that population does not eventually come into our school. So I was wondering, how is that overlay? I know it's a very weird statistical anomaly that's new to our district, not necessarily seen elsewhere. I can name several families right now who've come in the last year who are not in our district per se, and how that impacted, and also that is a massive birth rate. And I can tell you, pretty sure outside my family, most of them are not coming into the school district. So just curious about that, just so we have the best outlay for that. And I think that covered, and then not sure if it's now or later, just concerned for the next board meeting about coming up because it is on a Jewish holiday. And the observed day for just, it's a weird situation this year with how Passover falls out. Most end of it doesn't fall during spring break. So just to be careful about any action on that day. So thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Yaris. Anyone else? Okay. If not, we're going to move into our special action agenda, and I'll ask Mrs. Matlack to please move our CNI agenda.
Certainly. The superintendent recommends, and I move the following. 1, approval of attendance at conferences and workshops for the 2019-2020 school year. And 2, resolution to approve a professional service proposal. Do I have a second? Mrs. Schultz, any questions? Seeing none? Oh,
Sorry,
Dr.
just
Malash?
briefly. So we've had a number of discussions about online voting and about voting in general. Yes. We're going to go back to voice vote. We're going to do a roll call vote as we go through. So as you turn it to Mrs. Sugars will go through the roll call as she has done in the past. All right, so we're going to revert back to that.
Thank you. Okay. Any questions before we move to the vote? Okay, Mrs. Sugars, please.
Mrs. Arroyo?
Yes.
Ms. Friedel?
Yes.
Mr. Goodwin?
Yes.
Mrs. Matlack?
Yes.
Mrs. Neary?
Yes.
Mr. Avadia?
Yes.
Mrs. Schultz?
Yes.
Mrs. Tong?
Yes.
Mrs. Seidel?
Yes. Okay, Ms. Schultz, can you please move our B&F agenda?
Yep. The superintendent recommends, and I move the following. Number 1, approval of bill list. Number 2, preliminary budget for the 2020-2021 year. Number 3, maximum travel expenditure. Number 4, motion to approve use of capital reserve to fund approved projects for the 2020-2021 school year. Number 5, resolution for the award of bids. And number 6, resolution for the award of transportation. Do I have a second? Mrs. Matlack, are there any questions? Mrs. Friedel.
On 13.4, the use of capital reserve, can you give us a little bit of information on what the ADA compliance accessibility and where the HVAC replacements would be?
The ADA compliance issues are still being discussed, and oops, I forgot to turn off my timer. Hold on. Trying to do too many things at once.
As long as you can do it in 25 seconds.
You're done. So the ADA compliance would be a combination, mostly paving and curbing and line painting and sign purchase. We're still working with ERI to finalize those reports, so I can't tell you exactly. We've just allotted a certain amount of money towards those projects. The HVAC replacements would be at Hart and Malberg.
I have a question. For 13.2 with the budget, I didn't get to ask that when I was looking over it. For extracurricular activities, there was an increase from 2019 to 2020. But considering a lot of the conversations from past board meetings, it doesn't look like there's an increase for extracurricular activities. I don't know if there's going to be any additional conversation around that based on some of public comments that we've been listening to.
So if you're talking about additional stipends, so it's part of the negotiations, part of the collective bargaining process, to go through. So I don't have a whole lot else with that.
Any other questions? Seeing none.
Mrs. Arroyo,
Yes?
Ms. Friedel,
Yes.
Mr. Goodwin,
Yes.
Mrs. Matlack,
Yes.
Mrs. Neary,
Yes.
Mr. Avadia,
Yes.
Mrs. Schultz,
Need to abstain to Beata Home Health on the bill list. Yes to the rest.
Mrs. Tong,
Yes.
Mrs. Seidel.
Yes. Mrs. Tong, will you please move the HR agenda?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Adele. The superintendent recommend I move the following. 1, termination of employment certificated. 2, termination of employment non-certificated. 3, appointment certificated. 4, appointment not certificated. 5, assignment salary change certificated. 6, assignment salary change non-certificated. 7, other compensation certificated. 8, action consent to approve the human resource negotiation item 14.1 to 14.7, along with the pink sheet that was just handed out. 14.1, termination of employment certificated. 3, appointment certificated. 5, wait, let me see. Yep, 5, assignment salary change certificated. And other motion on number 8. Do I have it? Yes.
Second.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Groom, seconded. Is there any questions?
Can I just make a comment, Mrs. Tong? So one of the items that's on the handout, 14.8, the other motion, is SAC substitute coverage. So this is an unusual measure for us to take, but this is in the situation if we are notified that we have to close all of our schools, and there's a situation that's emergent through the Department of Health, and if we do that during the course of a day, if all of the SAC employees are unable for whatever reason to report to their sites, because as long as we have the children, we need to have somebody with the children until they are picked up, that we could have a volunteer from one of the schools, a teacher or an educational assistant, to fill in at SAC. So this is an emergency precaution, not something that we expect to take place or to happen, but should we need that, we wanted to make sure, and thank you to Ms. Adrian for making this happen, but to get everybody on just in case we run that situation, okay?
Thank you, Dr. Malash.
Ms. Arroyo,
Yes?
Ms. Friedel,
Yes.
Mr. Goodwin,
Yes.
Mrs. Matlack,
Yes.
Mrs. Neary,
Yes.
Mr. Avadia,
Yes.
Mrs. Schultz,
Yes.
Mrs. Tong, Mrs. Seidel.
Yes. Mrs. Neary, will you please move policy and legislation?
Certainly. The superintendent recommends, and I move the following. Number 1, approval of harassment, intimidation, bullying investigation decisions. Do I have a second? Ms. Schultz, any questions? Okay, seeing none, Mrs. Sugars.
Mrs. Arroyo?
I missed that, right? That one, abstain? Just making sure.
Ms. Friedel?
Yes.
Mr. Goodwin?
I'm abstaining from that one. I missed that meeting.
Mrs. Matlack?
Yes.
Mrs. Neary?
Yes.
Mr. Avadia?
Yes.
Mrs. Schultz?
Yes.
Mrs. Tong?
Abstain for both.
Mrs. Seidel?
Yes.
There are no items to move for strategic planning tonight, so we're going to move into our second public comment section, which will be on any item. If you would like to speak now, please speak into the microphone and clearly state your name and address. Each speaker will be given a maximum of 3 minutes to speak. The timer on the screen behind me will indicate the amount of time you have remaining.
Rick Short, 1002 Chelton Parkway. Board members, you just approved the budget. What happened with the budget for clubs? Are we giving our wonderful robotics club any money this year? I don't know. The public doesn't know. It's a hot topic, guys. Besides a stipend for them, what are their budgets? Didn't anyone do a budget? This is like a $200 million budget, and you have no budget for the clubs? Second thing, why is BNF so closed? It's like budget time. It should be open to the public. I don't really go to many, but there's other people that are complaining that these things are closed. The one adjustment I'd ask well, first off, because I have a little bit of time, had a wonderful meeting today with the district. I had 28 questions. 2 of them, I learned new things about security. I'm very happy with the progression. There are a couple little things, stuff you don't talk about publicly. But the one thing that just doesn't make any sense, and the thing is that any of you board members, I think, are worried about violating some ethics and saying anything, but I was here on a day when Steve Robbins would walk right here, and talk to the board. I say this because it's only about a $14,000 adjustment on a $200-some million budget. I think it's important for safety. What I'm proposing is to have 2 police cars, one directing traffic at west, and 1 police car directing traffic at east. I don't want to get into the technicalities of who or what or why. I just think it would be a better thing to have that. I mean, I still don't have the total number yet. I don't know if we're at $1 million that we spend in security, but I think for $14,000 or whatever it is a year, I think having them during the morning, you'd have, if anything ever happened. I'm not just talking about active shooter. I'm talking about, silly things. It's just better communication. And you see it at other schools too. And it would also help with traffic flow because you have a police car with lights on. They would probably more listen to it. So out of a $200 million budget, I'd like somebody to make a motion next week and say, you know what, let's talk about this. And then we would just pretty much have every possible security gap fixed. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Short.
Yoni Yaris, 329 Cherry Hill Boulevard. Checking the demographic study is going to be posted online. More importantly, can it be posted with explanation, because it's a lot of complex details and a lot of terms and letter alphabet that we often talk about getting away from in meetings, so that people can really understand it who weren't here. I was also curious if Malberg will get reviewed by strategic planning. I know it's a unique situation with 50% or more being administration and the rest of it being the alternative program. So just curious about where that will play into. I think from the past, Dr. Malash has spoken about it not qualifying for bond funding due to the nature of it being predominantly administrative. Will the NJEA Senate President Sweeney deal have an impact with anything with the district going on in the negotiations or our budgeting process? It looks like that's a pretty dramatic and major economic shift across the state that was shocking to a lot of us who followed it. And then just a traffic concern at night with West with Tech Week that took place with East being there. It was a little scary for those of us living in the neighborhood, with parents not knowing how to navigate in the line of cars down Chapel. Was extensive for a good half hour. Just when we have students at high schools at night, especially when they're unfamiliar with the area, of how we navigate people to prevent car accidents. So thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Yaris. Anyone else? Okay. Dr. Malash, are you able to answer any questions?
I am, Ms. Seidel. So Mr. Sugars went through a little bit of the ADA stuff. We certainly will be ongoing discussion about what that looks like and what that is. Our primary focus is about accessibility, right? Accessibility to get into the school, accessibility to get onto the playground. What does that look like for them? So that's a piece of it. For the continuity of learning plan for children of different learning abilities and disabilities to go through, Mrs. Wethington and the staff there'll be more intense discussion about what that looks like, and I'm sure, as there is right now, more direct communication between the teacher and the parents for where that is, to go in. So I will tell you, in this scenario, because you've been around for so much, we have 4 very fierce advocates for special education in the Pupil Services Department. Between the 3 special ed supervisors and Mrs. Wethington are fierce advocates, so that voice is carried for sure. What else? The $603,000, that does include the Alyssa's Law, and we will be compliant with Alyssa's Law this year. Yeah, we will actually have that. The Alyssa's Law notification, the silent panic alarms, we expect to be installed, if all goes well, before the end of spring, before spring break is over, when the kids return on the 14th of April. So that should be set to go. We're still waiting to see, we're planning on what we're going to do, and Mr. Sugars talked about with that reimbursement with the monies. The 1.9 in banked cap, there is not an advantage to the taxpayer.
We're required to use the spending growth limitation adjustment for enrollment first before we could use the bank cap. And that would be, we were already looking at a significant increases in taxes with just the spending growth limitation adjustment. So adding the bank cap on top of that would have compounded that more.
And we still have another year that we can use the banked cap, right? Yeah. So we will reevaluate next year as that goes through. We can follow up, and I'm not sure that I completely understand the question about the security funds and what that is, so I will follow up with you. You can give me more detail what it is you want to talk about. An interesting question about, right, the population and where those kids are going to go to school and what that looks like, and it is, right, so you're aware because of the community in which you're involved, and we're aware because we know, where there are certain families. Some of it is kids are born until they get into school. We can't say that, right, so that's where the projection is. Certainly part of the discussion, but more about where the projection is. We will take a look at April 14th, and what that is in terms of impact with Passover with that night. All right, thank you for bringing that up. Budgets for clubs are maintained at an individual building level. So money that is spent on any of the clubs, whether there's a stipend for a club advisor or not, because there's money that's spent on lots of clubs, comes out of the allotment that is provided to those schools. It's a local determination, so the principal often meets with students who are involved, meets with an advisor for a club who's involved, about what monies may be needed from one year to the next. Student activities advisors involved in those discussions as well. So that's a building-based discussion. There really wouldn't be anything on the budget or on the Mrs. Sugar's presentation, they will include within that. When we do closed committee meetings, and again, Cherry Hill is one of the unique school districts in the state that does committee meetings that are open. When they are closed, it's because it deals with a legal matter, a personnel matter, as we do with HR and Mrs. Tong reports out on. But the other ones, it deals with a legal matter, something that involves a legal matter, so that it can't be discussed publicly. Once that information can be shared publicly, it shall be. One of the other things that we've done in BNF is we did interviews for architects back in February to go through. Because it's an interview process, that's closed. The March 30th meeting that's going to be closed, we're going to be interviewing with solicitors at that meeting. So that's why that's closed, because it's an interview process that takes place. And I agree. I think we had a really good hour-long meeting this morning. So I appreciate that. Will Dr. Grip's information, will that be posted? So I'm not sure what we'll look at that. I assume the presentation that we saw tonight, we will be able to share, as a PDF on the website. We can certainly have additional discussion if people have questions. There is a lot of technical information that's in there, and I will tell you that's the broken down information, right? That's the understandable for the community. And again, as somebody, because that's not my area of strength at all, I'm fascinated, right, by the manipulation and the analysis of those numbers. Just when he talks about doing a multiple regression analysis, right, it makes my heart a little aflutter. We will not be reviewing Malberg. It's not one of the buildings that we're reviewing, because you're right, it's not one of the things that we will include in referendum project to go forward. The impact of what Senator Sweeney and Ms. Bliston announced about state health benefits and the benefits plan, we're still evaluating what that means, and what that will mean. And there will, I'm sure, be some additional guideline that will come out, or guidelines that will come out from the state if there's going to be an impact or something for school districts. And then traffic, absolutely, we can always talk with kids about being safe, and parents. Daytime, nighttime, right? Always something that we want to make sure we do. So I think that's. Mrs. Wilson also provided Lori Deitch's email address for me that you talked about before. So two things. So one, if you Google search Cherry Hill Fair Funding, you can find it. They also have a Facebook page that is active. If you want to get a hold with Lori, it's CDEITCH 68804 at Comcast.net. CDEITCH 68804 at Comcast.net. She's always looking for more people.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay.
I have a question on the continuous learning. In case I guess, I'm not sure if every parents or every household have an internet in Cherry Hill. In case they don't have it, how will we provide them in that situation?
So we can't necessarily provide internet access to them. We can provide resources from some of the local vendors that have accessibility and can help with accessibility. And there's a number of different things that play into what that accessibility looks like. We've received contacts over the last couple of days from some of the local vendors that are trying to make it more accessible, especially if children or families are in this situation.
Thank you, Dr. Malash.
Okay, so that concludes our meeting. Thank you all for coming. We are actually going to be moving back into a second executive session. No action will be taken. We're going into second executive session to discuss personnel and legal matters. Again, no action will be taken afterwards. Can I have a motion to convene to second public session? Mr. Goodwin and Mrs. Matlack, all in favor? Motion carries. Thank you.